the other one, you bastard!
Brought to you by supporters who probably have better taste than this schmuck.
The art of a video game trailer is often one that's overlooked. Since we're not just dealing with traditional media, you can't just plonk a few scenes there and call it a day. One must balance gameplay, story, atmosphere, and a whole heap of other things into a neat package. Sure, to certain company fanatics, all they need to do is plonk a logo in place and people will go nuts. But the average consumer still needs to be convinced why they should invest an unhealthy amount of their life into something that half of society thinks is somehow both childish yet exceedingly violent to a psychotic degree. Bit of an oxymoron there, eh? The undisputed king of video game trailers is, as many will agree, Nintendo. Hell, the amount of reaction videos to their content is proof enough. People have performed studies on the effectiveness of Breath of the Wild's Switch presentation trailer, some even touting it as a piece of art itself. These days their advertising is so effective that they are often placed on the pedestal of saving a certain event just by showing up, as was the case with E3 2021. As the event progressed, there were certainly quite a few exciting reveals, but it wasn't until the midpoints that people really got talking. Boom! New 2D Metroid. Boom! Continuation of the storyline. Boom! Dread is here. Now, at the time, I had no idea of the significance of such a title. In essence, Dread to Metroid fans is what the Bionis shoulder is to myself. A pipe dream of lost content that was thought to be forever cast aside. Until now. Except, you know, hopefully Metroid Dread won't be a complete dumpster fire. Now, as a non-Metroid fan, I initially thought, oh, cool, that looks neat. But after rewatching the trailer a few times, I slowly but surely became enthralled with what was at play here. And to be fair, this is a really good trailer. After bombarding you with the true terror that awaits, they just keep going and going and going, pushing the tension to the limits. Now, I must admit I'm not particularly a fan of horror games, but Dread looks interesting. So I plonked a $30 deposit on the special edition because in Australia they have the basic decency to implement a one per customer rule, and sat back, ready for October. But wait, I've never played a Metroid game in my life. What to do? Where to start? This is quite a predicament, isn't it? I have to play through an entire franchise of games in order to fully grasp the importance of such a landmark title. Well, guess I've got my work cut out for me, haven't I?
You are now entering Diagnosis Insanity.
Okay, if I'm being real, figuring out where to start isn't that difficult at all. Turns out it's not some abandoned niche series that nobody cares about. A huge, loving and caring community has been patiently waiting for its return. The reaction to Metroid Dread is very similar to what happened when Xenoblade Chronicles Definitive Edition came out. Granted, it's in relation to previous games as opposed to things to do within a singular game, but it's the same deal. The fandom has pumped out a ton of videos outlining where to start, which systems to jump onto, and which ones to apparently avoid like the plague. Still got a morbid curiosity about that one. Either way, absolutely love to see it. I've been there. I get what these peeps are doing. And hey, these sorts of videos greatly help an absolute Metroid noob like myself. If you're one of the fans who's engaged in videos like this, accept my thanks. Go out and get a slice of cake or some shit, provided you're not stuck in lockdown like I am. That said, the actual biggest problem pertaining to getting into the Metroid franchise is system accessibility. Nintendo has not made it at all easy to access its older games. This appears to be an ongoing problem for most of their franchises, especially in the Switch era. I also really don't like how the Switch Online service will one day just vanish and you won't have those games anymore. But that's another complaint for another time. Point is, it's hard to play the previous games in the franchise unless you have very specific systems to do so, which, fortunately, I do. In fact, I got some funds together to purchase the 2 titles I still needed, only to find I'd already done so months ago. Way to go, past me. So, when I say I have no experience with Metroid, I really do mean it. The closest I've ever had was a few hours on the 3DS Virtual Console version of the original game. Yes, the NES original. Matter of fact, it was my first ever purchase on the 3DS eShop, followed by Gunman Clive shortly after. But let's be real, NES games kinda stink these days. Very few of them have actually aged well, despite holding massive cultural significance. In fact, the only NES game that I have experienced and still believe fully holds up to modern standards isn't even an NES game. Hell, it ain't even on the Switch, come on man! Either way, it's 2020. We don't need to play on clunky old engines anymore. We have the technology. As such, first on the menu.
Ground control to Major Tom.
Major spoilers for Metroid Zero Mission, Samus Returns, Super, and Fusion. You've been warned, Maggot!
Beyond never playing a Metroid game before, I can't say I've played many Metroidvanias to begin with. I mean, I've dabbled in the first Castlevania game, but that's really just a linear action game. Doesn't really carry the same meaning. Aside from that, it's really just Cave Story, Hellboy, and Hollow Knight. So I kinda get the gist of the genre, but I haven't fully grasped what it's capable of. Because of this, I was basically going in blind. So I boot up the game, watch some pretty dated slideshow cutscenes, courtesy of the Game Boy's limited power, and bam, I'm in. The first thing that sticks out out to me is the fluidity of movement. Something about Zero Mission just feels more natural than the few other Metroidvanias I've played. From the moment I gathered my bearings, Samus felt like an extension of my actions as opposed to something wholly disconnected. No disrespect to those other games, but it definitely stuck out to me. The next thing that really stuck out to me was the aesthetic. Now, I never grew up with the Game Boy Advance. My family didn't really let me have any consoles until I was almost into high school, and I didn't start buying any games for myself until the 3DS era. That said, one thing that always stuck out to me about DS titles is that when blown up they seem pretty disgusting. From what I've seen, the same principle typically applies to GBA games, but surprisingly not this one. Zero Mission looks gorgeous on a larger screen. Granted, I played this mostly on the Wii U gamepad so I could slouch around on the bed for ease of comfort, but damn, this pixel art is gorgeous. It starts out pretty tame with some simple shadowy areas in Brinstar, but once you get out of there, hot damn, it starts looking beautiful. The game is you traversing the planet Zebes, and most of the environments are meticulously crafted. My favorite of the bunch would easily have to be Norfar, especially the far right area with its serene, bubbly stuff. Looks like something out of Nashka, specifically one of the quieter moments. The lava sections were a treat too. It's quite amazing what they were able to accomplish with the hardware, immersing you in the unbearable temperature. On the topic of technology, the parallax effect is also exquisite. I realize with more recent pixel art games, such is often taken for granted, but honestly I didn't expect much going into this. Sure, I never have had much experience with the Game Boy Advance, but whenever I hear that console name, I think of Zelda titles, and the extremely bit-crushed Mario Kart. This is actually extremely well done. I'd expect something like this on the DS, but not on the GBA. Guess it shows how ill-informed I was on the subject. Also gotta give a shout out to Kraid's Lair. Gives the appearance of being part of a lost civilization taken over by a mad scientist for his dastardly experiments. Obviously not a society as ancient as the Chozos, which is apparently what those bird things are called, but something more recent, albeit still abandoned. Really gave me a cave story vibe, as if a society similar to the Mimigas inhabited such a place. Matter of fact, I can really see where Cave Story got all of its ideas. The aesthetic is strikingly similar, and they've even reused the energy pickup sound. I think my favorite aesthetic, however, would have to be these save rooms. I don't know why I like these so much, they're just so well done, especially how the background lights up in sequence. Speaking of, these save rooms are pretty well placed. Yes, I played on a Wii U with save states, but more often than not, the save rooms were more help. I was more likely to use those, which is the mark of a good setup. Speaking of, the way in which this game is laid out is remarkably well done. The NES original may have been revolutionary for the time, but me, it was cryptic. I didn't bother playing much of it in preparation for this video because 2 minutes in and... no thanks, but from what I remember about my childhood quote-unquote playthrough, there was no indication of what to do. With Zero Mission, I expected to at some point hit a snag about where to go. Surprisingly, that moment never came. It's not just the map rooms, nor is it just the telegraphing of interesting locations. They've tweaked everything ever so slightly, creating a very clear line of progression. The game strikes a wonderful balance of linearity and exploration. Sure, the game has you running around the map and backtracking up the arse, but there's always a clear place to go. Things crisscross, but everything opens up evenly. Sorry to bring it up again, but it reminds me quite a bit of my favorite game of all time, Beano's Laid Crunchicles. The game is open as but most of the maps actually have a clear-cut location for you to seek out, and you never find yourself getting lost in unfinished geometry and confusing level heights like Xenoblade 2 or Future Connected. I realize this is a wholly different genre, but the concept is exactly the same. At no point did I have to open a wiki to figure out where to go. Sure, I did use walkthroughs to find some of the hidden secrets, because some of those are cheeky bastards, but even then those were few and far between. Well, actually, now that I think about it, that's not quite true. There was one moment where I had to look up how to get through an area. Turns out there was fake lava, something which definitely could have been telegraphed better. Still, that aside, once you figure this one out, you learn to be more perceptive of your environment. Not every floor or wall is real. Perspective is often messed with. Point is, though, with the exception of that, the game telegraphs its progression pretty clearly. And for the secrets, more often than not, all I had to do was check the map, see if there was a circly thingy, and make my way over there with the upgrades I had. Speaking of, most of the upgrades were surprisingly well utilized. One thing I really dislike about certain video games is when an ability is only there to arbitrarily halt progress. It doesn't just apply to platformers of this nature. A lot of exploratory games do this. At that point, just come up with a story reason for it. With one exception, fortunately, none of the powers feel like this. I don't particularly have a favorite per se, but they all seem to do a good job. That said, the one exception happens at the end of the game. These goddamn super bomb thingies. Yeah, these are just there for the sake of completionism. The only reason for having these is to open up the room to the final boss and unlock extra secrets if you want to go 100%, which I didn't. I swear this number was entirely coincidental. I feel you could have gone the entire game without these goddamn things. They pop up way too late and basically provide nothing. That said, it wouldn't be my least favorite. This might be a shock, but I don't like the screw attack. It's so difficult to use, always activating when you don't want it to. And whenever you're trying to access a certain ledge, whoops, it broke. If they had ditched this mechanic and just added a double jump instead, I would have been way happier. At the time of writing this, since I'm writing the script as I complete each game, I have no clue if they're going to fix this in the games to come. But as it stands, come on, mates. And hell, more often than not, you'll just get blasted by incoming projectiles. I genuinely wanted to go back to the moment where I didn't have the screw attack upon first getting it. Yeah, Dr. Lockdown from the future here. I might want to change my channel name to Dr. Dumbdown. I was just notified by my mate Firebite that you can actually unequip upgrades at any point. God, I am a idiot. Now that said, towards the end of the game you do get an upgraded suit that gives you extra damage power whilst in screw attack mode. This does make it somewhat more palatable, but by this point I'd gotten used to controlling it more. But that's when they give you the worst mechanic in the entire game. Infinite jumping. Christ, I feel like I'm breaking the game at this point. What's even the point of it? Why not just offer a wall climb or some shit? Christ, this is tedious. Albeit not as tedious as some of the backtracking. One thing I really wish they'd done is offered some sort of teleportation device between save rooms. It really would have made things much more smooth. It's not a very long game to begin with, but it could have been even more streamlined with some fast travel. Oh well, ultimately neither of these issues spoil the game. If those are the only things stuck from the past, I think they've done a really good job. Sadly though, they aren't. By virtue of being a remade NES game, some of the boss fights kinda suck. Granted, it's definitely not all of them. A few of them really stand out. This sort of worm thing that kinda pops out of nowhere was pretty fun. Sort of reminded me of something out of the Zelda Oracle games, with that classic 8-bit boss fight charm, only in fancier graphics. Then there's Kraid. Damn, this was a good one. It's tough, real tough, but reasonably so. It gives you a real sense of terror, something which works quite well given what Metroid takes its inspiration from. Then you have this moth bug thing. At first, you don't assume much. It's just kind of there as a mini-boss, so you don't have to pay it too much attention. But then when you try to progress beyond, you can't. It doesn't work properly, so you circle back to see what you've missed. Maybe you just went down the... Oh dear. No, that can't be. No, they wouldn't dare. No, there's... Oh my god! No, help me! Now in the grand scheme of things, this boss fight isn't actually too hard, but at the time you're not thinking of such because you just shit your pants at how horrifying this is. And apparently this boss fight is entirely optional? Like, I thought you needed the super missiles to open certain doors, but apparently according to research I did after the finished game, that's not the case. Of course, the question remains, what makes specifically these two boss fights work whilst others do not? Well, turns out Waspinator here is a completely new addition. He was designed completely from the ground up, so they were able to go nuts. Kraid was also given a massively different attack pattern to the original, as well as a beefier aesthetic to echo his chonkiness in Super. I watched some videos on the original and, oh boy, this is rough. Of course, Kraid uses similar attack patterns from Super Metroid, which I'm sure I'll be able to find out in due time, but the point is these two work because the developers were able to avoid the original concept. Sadly, the other two bosses stick far too closely to their roots. Ridley, the franchise's most iconic villain, the one that everyone says is supposed to be the most terrifying Nintendo villain, is a bitch! This fellow barely put up a fight, just chuck some missiles at him and bada bing bada boom, done deal. First impressions, not great, really hoping future games do him better. Then there's Mother Brain and, oh boy, this one stinks. From what I can gather, the NES one was the typical chuck shit at the screen and hope it's somehow engaging bullshit, and what do the Zero Mission devs do? Make it worse! Just getting to the boss is a pain, thank for save states, and then actually taking it out, oh boy. Say you gotta stand on this platform and jump out of the way when they fire the laser. After that, you have to carefully land on this other platform. If you miss, Mother Brain will close its eyes and you can't do shit. If you take too long to land, Mother Brain will close its eyes and you can't do shit. Oh, and don't forget you have to dodge all those projectiles and use the screw attack, which throws off your jumps massively, as if I didn't hate this thing enough. Fortunately, I had enough missiles to get this over with, but me. If it didn't have save states, I'd be pissed. Yes, you, I used save states. What are you gonna do? I'm a busy man. I can't spend 3 goddamn weeks on a single boss fight. Even the Metroids themselves felt like better bosses. They weren't, per se, just being hard enemies that needed missiles to defeat. But they actually had a sense of horror to them, fading in from the background. Plus, you had to manage your resources, being careful not to run out of everything, lest you start over. And the final room has you fighting enemies to get your health back, as opposed to a one-and-done heal-me-do. This is a hella neat feature, and it really highlights the danger of the situation. It's just a shame that it's followed by, well, this. Still, with all said and done, it's a pretty good game. I can definitely see why people are such a big fan of the franchise, and I'm eager to... Wait, what the hell? Oh dearie me. Now this is cool. After they're done with the main story covered in the NES original, if it can even be called a story, you're stripped of everything. Up until this point, you felt pretty competent at taking the environment. With all the power-ups at your disposal and that wasp thing behind you, Zebes feels pretty chill now. Zero Mission then goes that. Now you gotta sneak around and avoid getting your ass kicked. What surprises me is that this game actually does stealth really well. How many times have you entered a stealth section and the AI has just forgotten you existed? How many times has the consequence of failing stealth been basically non-existent? None of that shit here. These space pirate bastards know you're sneaking around and are purposefully looking for you. And if they catch you, oh boy, you're overlooked. This right here is easily the most tense part of the whole game. Well, maybe the second most tense, but it really puts into perspective how much of a badass you were with the suit you previously possessed. It doesn't feel like a video game level either. Despite being a pretty linear 2D environment, you still get the feeling this is an actual ship with multiple levels, each serving their own function. Of course, this section doesn't go on forever, and eventually you don the final suit in the game and bam, time to do business. From this point on, you're basically kicking ass and taking names. You're pretty much free to explore the whole ship, and the rest of the map again for that matter. There's not a ton to go through, but it's really fun sneaking around and finding... Wait a minute. Hang on, what's that sound?
Oh, hi, Mark.
Ah, shit. Can't say I was in any way scared, but at this point I just let myself get killed by what I'm assuming is Mecha Ridley, because I didn't realize where I was going at the time. I still wanted to do some exploring, so I could pick up some extra power-ups. Turns out, I probably shouldn't have. Everything from the point of Chozodia isn't just completely optional, but pretty goddamn tedious. The backtracking at this stage became way too much to bear, especially since a lot of it involved infinite jump spamming, which just isn't fun. Word of advice, once you get the Deus Ex bomb in her, just go kill that son of a bitch. Finish the game on a high note, don't go for 100%, it just ain't worth it. Not to say this is a particularly good boss fight though. Sure, it's slightly better than the first one, but it's still pretty underwhelming. Again, I'm just not seeing any reason to fear this guy. It's fine, I guess, but I'm not affording Ridley any respect at this point. Still, with that all said and done, it was pretty good. Right off the bat, I can see why people really love this franchise. Not everything is aged super well, but there's definitely a solid core here that overrides everything. Zero Mission is definitely a game I'd happily play again sometime. It's not the longest, but any longer and I reckon it would have overstayed its welcome. Boy though, I am so glad the first game didn't suck ass, otherwise I might have been put off the franchise entirely. Turns out the game an entire genre is partially named after is pretty good. Kudos. With 13 years between games in the franchise, 10 years since the last good one, at least in the eyes of the fandom, and 13 years between 2D Metroidvania-y Metroid games, anticipation for this title was pretty high. Or it would have been if they didn't announce a logo just an hour or so prior.
Where's that music? Please tell me it's Metroid Prime 4!
Samus Returns is a massive jump into the future for the franchise in terms of design. Helmed by the guys who made this game nobody's ever heard of. I think it's a spin-off of the Netflix show? I don't know. Point is, although it never reached widespread acclaim, from what I can gather, core Metroid fans were frothing over this one, and another game at roughly the same time. At this point, I have to address the Metroid Queen in the room. Yes, I'm playing Samus Returns, not AM2R. For those not in the know, AM2R is a fan game that basically does the same thing as Samus Returns. Remake the old Game Boy Return of Samus game. Fans of this version, at least in my experience, are incredibly vocal about the supposed superiority of the fan version. I haven't played AM2R, so for all I know, they could be right. But there are a few reasons as to why I went with the official option over the fan version. Firstly, my recording setup is kinda stinky. My PC glitches all the time and I'm not used to setting up recording of PC games. I'm much more used to Elgato and Soundflower, not to mention Premiere only seems to work on my Mac. I really want to transition away from using this clunky garbage and onto a proper PC, but considering external circumstances, doesn't look like it'll be an option at this point in time. Furthermore, I really need an excuse to use my recently purchased capture card for taxation reasons. It's expensive as f***, and if I don't use it in a video, that's all that money out of pocket. Don't judge me, I bought it for the explicit use of making videos. Its installation has no bearing on which games I buy and don't. That said, I also already own Samus Returns and was always looking for an excuse to jump in. This marathon playthrough gave me an opportunity to do just that. These are the primary reasons why I chose this version of the game. I can assure you it's nothing to do with AM2R being unofficial and Samus Returns being Nintendo published. Fan games can be great, don't get me wrong, it's just that in this instance it was far easier and far more advantageous to take a look at Samus Returns instead. And I'm glad I did, not because it's the definitive better of the two, but because it's definitely the more interesting to talk about. What I mean to say is Samus Returns is a bit of a mixed bag, and ultimately that gives me a lot more to discuss in video essay form. That's not to say I didn't like my time here, I most certainly did. The gameplay itself is much snappier, much more fluid than its Game Boy predecessor. I mean this Game Boy predecessor, not this one. Moving through environments feels far more natural, and the 360 targeting systems are fantastic. Doubly so once you get the wave beam. Is it overpowered? Sure, but it's hella fun. Things that weren't necessarily bad in Zero Mission still feel much better in this title, such as the precision of the space jump. Although I am glad they're finally adding a proper double jump in Dread. You'd think it would have been a staple by now, but apparently despite being the landmark title that the entire genre is partially named after, double jumps never came to mind. And of course, it's all capped off with this game's biggest addition, the melee counter. Discourse on this edition has been pretty rampant, even years after this game's release. I can definitely see why people dislike it. From my brief experience with Zero Mission, I can tell there's an effortless charm to bouncing around, avoiding enemies, and landing your shots just right. It's not really a combat emphasis per se, but it's a style of gameplay I can definitely see people getting attached to. The brawl counter is a drastic departure from this, forcing you to stand your ground and time things just right. This sort of gameplay style is definitely more commonly associated with action games, so this hullabaloo about it not gelling with the rest of the gameplay makes sense. Personally though, I really dig the 4 3DS and Wii U counter. It was definitely a pretty steep learning curve. I noticed right off the bat that the timing was somewhat different from the norm. Compared to other games I've found it in, the counter seemed to be placed a little later than I was used to. Once I did get used to it though, it was hella fun to pull off. With the 3DS's tiny screen, I admit it was a tad difficult to gauge the timing occasionally, a problem similar to the zoomed in nature of Super Mario Bros. Deluxe on the Game Boy Color, but especially in boss fights, it was an absolute blast. That said, it does feel a little bit separated from the rest of the gameplay, something which I'd love to see them improve upon in the future. Fortunately, from the footage seen in the upcoming Dread game, they've made some tweaks to integrate it better. It's funny how playing through the other games slowly but surely raises my hype for that eventual release. But taking it back to Mercury Steam's first attempt, this definitely feels like that, a first attempt. The game starts out pretty strong, plunging you into the fluid gameplay and pretty well realized art style. This game essentially is you going on a genocide run throughout the caverns of Hostile Planet SR388, which I keep getting mixed up for Studio Series Optimus Prime and Siege Springer. I spend way too much time on Transformers social media. That premise in itself brings up issues with the pacing, but right off the bat you're greeted with fantastic world design. From 2 seconds research, I can sort of gather they switched around the level design to encourage more exploration and backtracking with later upgrades, but the graphic design is where the biggest upgrade is felt. They took that awesome parallax effect from Zero Mission and translated it into fully 3D environments. Despite primarily consisting of enough blocks to consider this a potential Minecraft project, this really feels like a lived-in world. Nothing gave the atmosphere of just being another video game level, a massive feat considering the game hardware. Only one other game on the 3DS gave me the same feeling, and if we're being real, it's not a fair comparison since that was originally a Wii game. I can only imagine what these environments look like in 3D. Personally, I never used the 3D feature, so I side-graded to a new 2DS XL. The speaker issue never bothered me since I always use headphones anyway, but the point is, if I did have access to 3D, I imagine it would possibly be one of the best effects on the system. It also feels super seamless too. At no point does the effects let up due to lack of care in any specific area. Every background has something unique to it, with so much environmental storytelling. I kept looking at the wildlife moving around and hoping it would lead to a boss fight, but oh well, maybe in a future game. The only parts where I'm taken out of the experience are the elevators and teleporters, since the frame rate takes a hefty plunge for some reason, probably while they load the next area. Really hoping they fix this for Dread, but as it stands, it's only a small blemish. The kind of atmosphere made traversing SR388 tolerable even in its most sluggish moments. And thank God for that, because the pacing of this game can be an absolute slog at times. So, this is a remake of an old Game Boy game, right? Not a Game Boy Advance one, not a Game Boy Color one, just a traditional Game Boy game. As such, obviously changes have to be made to bring it into the modern era. As such, the entire map is completely redone, remixing certain areas for increased challenge and adding a shit ton of secret rooms. Having to go back to all of them in the post-game is fine, it offers an extra bit of challenge for those going for 100%. The problem is that they've kept the map layout exactly the same. The individual room changes make your time in each zone much longer, and when combined with the antiquated linear layout of the original, the game loses steam pretty quickly. Again, I haven't played a lot of Metroidvanias, but with the ones I have played, one of the best bits is seeing how the world interconnects and opens up. When you're kind of just going in one direction the whole time, it feels a lot longer than it actually is. Or rather, it feels as long as it actually is. This is a substantially longer title than any of the others, and thanks to the way this world is set up, you really feel it. Now, that's not to say traversing each area isn't fun in its own right, especially with the new Ion abilities. You've got the Gatling Gun of Death, the Miss Me With That Shield, which replaces the speed boost and is leagues better considering you don't have to gain enough momentum for it to work, and the Scan Pulse. I loved the map rooms in Zero Mission, primarily for that rush of finally figuring out where to go and what to do next. But in terms of modernity, this feature works much better. I'm hoping a sort of middle ground can be achieved between the Scan Pulses and the map rooms in Dread, but if I had to choose one or the other, yeah, I'd choose the map pulse in a heartbeat. Traversing these areas is fun, especially with the mobility options offered, but focusing on that is sort of missing the forest for the trees. I understand that this is a remake, but since they've drastically altered the layout of the individual levels, doing the same for the progression between them would have been an amazing addition to round out the updates. This sluggish pacing is made even worse with the boss fights though. In a vacuum, they're pretty good. All the variations of the Metroid on their own are fun to fight, but then they start reusing them again, and again, and again. It wears thin extremely quickly, especially with the second evolution. Yeah, stopping the boss fight in the middle and migrating to another room. Totally fun mechanic, motherfuckers. It feels like this was a constraint brought about through both the budget and the original game. The 1991 original was built upon the idea of committing genocide on these motherfuckers so changing such a fundamental part of this story's identity would be quite the controversial decision. Perhaps more so than the directors or any audience would be willing to accept. This combined with the limitations of the 3DS budget and space, yeah, I get why they reused a lot of these. But for fuck's sake, cut it out with the room-changing bullshit. It works well as a one-off to create tension, but here it's just because. And this boss fight is actually quite fun without this nonsense. You get to experience single-room variations in the final third of the game, and it's genuinely fun. But nope, gotta deal with all this bullshit. Another limitation of either the budget or the hardware is the overall feel of the game. I don't know how to put it, but in spite of the gorgeous visuals and the fluidity of motion, a lot of this still felt like I was observing a video game. It didn't feel like I was truly getting sucked into the world, which was something I really liked with Zero Mission. Now, this is definitely something I don't have a solution for, but when other games on the platform have engrossed me to much higher levels, even in the same genre, I can tell there were some limitations. Maybe the music has something to do with it, because oh boy, it's rough. I don't know about you guys, but more often than not, I find myself gravitating to video game music much more than film and television soundtracks. The philosophy behind composing a video game song just gels with me far more. It evokes emotions tied to certain areas and events. I put a video game song in the background and I'm instantly brought back to the time where I first played through that section. Samus Returns soundtrack doesn't do that. Whilst veterans of the franchise returned to supervise this game's composition, the soundtrack was primarily composed by newcomer Daisuke Matsuoka, and looking at his track records, nothing really jumps out at me. Still, I really feel for him. There aren't a lot of bangers from the original game. Sure, there's the upbeat surface theme, but beyond that, it's mostly... It would have been really good to overhaul the soundtrack using leitmotifs similar to the Game Boy bloops and bleeps, but instead they've gone for fairly generic atmospheric nonsense. As such, I find it hard to pick a favourite part of the game. Nothing really stands out except this one segment where this beautiful melody flows in, mysterious yet comforting. It brings the feeling that Samus is finally gaining control of her environment, and that she no longer feels threatened by her surroundings. It's calm yet otherworldly, and a true highlight of the game. Which is a shame because it's actually a cover of a song from Super Metroid. I'm all for callbacks, but had the game used music of this caliber, I would have been way more into it. Music is immensely important for game design, and Nintendo music is some of the best around. It's just a shame that some of these songs are on the same level as Chibi Robo Ziplash. And suddenly I feel the need to say this soundtrack blows and throw the CD in the toilet, if there is a CD. That's not to say this game doesn't have any highlights though. When the boss fights actually get interesting, the experience truly shines. The Diggernaut, the Diggernaut. I've seen people complain about this boss fight being unfair, but in my experience, it was incredibly fun. Every attack was fair, but challenging, offering plenty of opportunities to outmaneuver it. They even incorporated use of the Morph Ball, something I was really missing from the fights in Zero Mission. The way it's built up too, you're anticipating it throughout each area, and the payoff is great. The Metroid Queen was also decent. At first I hated this boss fight, but in retrospect, I was probably just sleep deprived at the time. After taking a week's break to work on another toy review, I came back to it and killed her within 20 minutes. And that's without even realizing you can enter her mouth in Morph Ball form. If I ever replay the game, that's something I've got to try out. Also, Ridley turns up at the end and apparently everyone's surprised by this. As only a recent Metroid fan without any point of reference, I kinda expected him to show up at some point, but hey, I don't have the context. And I'm a f***wit. The boss fight itself, although pretty easy, was hella fun. It was a nice change of pace not to need to use missiles for it. Just open up heavy Sasha and blast him with the energy of 1,000 angry AM2R fans after Nintendo issued a DMCA. Stop reporting on fan games. Idiotic news outlets. I still don't see why he's as popular as the likes of Bowser or Metal Face, because I've yet to come across an encounter where he's depicted as a genuine threat, but at least the fight was more mechanically sound than the two found in Zero Mission. Overall, a nice way to cap off the experience. Samus Returns definitely slogs in the middle, but it starts and ends incredibly strong. I definitely still prefer Zero Mission, with its smaller but denser world, and its beautiful pixel art, but this was still a great experience. As stated earlier, this feels especially like a first attempt, a foundation that will act as the basis for a hopefully better, dreadful experience. Still, what it does well, it does really well. Translating the 2D artwork to 3D is done with an incredible amount of finesse, and I'm eager to see how it'll pan out on a beefier console. The movement mechanics are super fluid, and seeing how in gameplay demos they appear to have cranked it up to 11, I can't wait to try it out. It's a fantastic blueprint, but as a game in its own right, it's just decent. I don't know if there will be any point going back to it in the future after Dread's release, especially with the difficulties in emulating 3DS games thanks to limited optimization and lack of touchscreen, but for now I'm definitely glad I gave it a shot. Sure, I may not have been inclined to go back and grab all the power-ups, not just because of time, but also because I didn't want to slog through the entire map again, but for what I did play, I definitely got my money's worth.
Superman.
This one was a tough one to wrap my head around. Not in the sense of the game itself, although that was partially the case, but rather in my thoughts surrounding it. With the previous two games, I pretty much wrote those two portions of the script the day after finishing them, so everything was still fresh in my mind. Super Metroid was different. It's a game that sticks with you for a bit, and you sort of start to wonder, was it really great, or have you kinda just developed Stockholm Syndrome after having your face bashed in a million times? First impressions weren't great, although you can't really fault the game itself for that. Coming straight from Samus Returns, the most fluid game in the series by far, it feels almost jarring. Your movement is like a tank with rigor mortis setting in by comparison. You definitely get a metaphorical form of whiplash when playing the games in chronological order, as opposed to release order. Matter of fact, this very whiplash kinda made me reconsider this whole approach in retrospect. Or at least it did at the time. Later on, those thoughts subsided, but mate, the start of this game is pretty confusing. It begins by lulling you into a sense of security. Going back to the map system seen in Zero Mission, or rather introducing the map system seen in Zero Mission, it begins with a fairly straightforward layout. It starts off a lot less cryptic than earlier entries, not linear per se, but definitely featuring less confusion than both Zero Mission and Samus Returns. Even in the most confusing times, a little bit of detective work is all that suffices in order to get going on your merry way. One thing that was greatly appreciated was the access to super bombs and super missiles incredibly early. In the previous two games, they arrived either in the last third, or worse, in the end game, leaving you with not a lot of time to experiment. Bringing them in extremely early allows for much more fun level progression, and it makes the difficulty curve feel much more natural. Of course, to compensate this, they give you far fewer of these items. In Samus Returns, it almost felt like I was getting too many missiles towards the end. It ended up making discoveries of even more missiles seem moot, since my counter was already pretty high. Oh great, another missile expansion, and it ain't green. Thrilling. The low number you get here forces you to explore and expand, further engaging you with the level design. Speaking of, it's back to that wonderful unique charm of Zero Mission. Every room feels unique from each other, no two rooms are identical. Coming off Samus Returns, which reused quite a few assets by virtue of its 3D design, it was a really nice breath of fresh air. Honestly, it's something I'm a bit concerned about for Dread. I hope the developers were afforded enough time and money to craft many a unique set piece. Of course, each room isn't just unique in the sense of its level design, a lot of that comes down to the environments themselves. And hot damn, this is easily some of the best pixel art the era has to offer. At times it even rivals many modern pixel art games in its fidelity. Yes, the art direction is just that good. Wonderful to know that praise for this style isn't just boomers getting nostalgic for the better days. It's a genuinely well-crafted visual experience. And the music, by God, this has to be my favorite soundtrack so far. So you remember all that atmospheric nonsense in the last game? Well, turns out they were trying to emulate this style of music, outside of pulling songs wholesale for the sake of throwbacks. Fun fact, the Lower Brinstar theme wasn't the only theme pulled for Samus Returns. The lava theme was also a throwback to the depths of Norfair, and predictably, they butchered it with overbearing horns that would make the Hoenn region get the heart eyes. Yes, I'm aware I called it Norfar earlier in this video, I didn't realize until halfway that I had misread the area name. As I keep saying, I'm a quit. Sit me down at the Salt and Pepper Diner and put 5 plays of What's New Pussycat because we've covered my idiocy before. Thing is, to create atmosphere, you can't just drop a cat on a keyboard, output the MIDI values into a harmonizer, and hey presto, sci-fi horror soundtrack ready for the latest Nintendo console. True menacing atmosphere comes from careful composition, and there's basically not a single song in here that I find bad. It's not the most extensive soundtrack in the world, but what it lacks in quantity, it easily makes up for in quality. Every song instantly takes you back to the time you traversed whatever area it's from. That's what a brilliant game soundtrack does. Play me any song from a Xenoblade game and I'll instantly be able to recall practically the whole map layout. Except Gormott, because whoever designed this area was drunk as f***. What I mean to say is, this soundtrack is some good shit. Even added a song to my review lineup, which is how you know it made an impact on me. Now I'm just hoping Dread doesn't f*** up any of this music like Samus Returns did. Please have good music, Dread. Please have good music. Anyway, so all of these environmental and presentation systems work incredibly well in immersing you in the world of Zebes once again. The feeling that you're not welcome remains ever present, perhaps more so than previous titles. However, at some point things start getting weird. You go through things at a pretty consistent rate until you don't. Where you need to go is almost always obvious, but rooms start bringing forth more and more puzzle elements. This is typically a good thing, but at some point it starts getting overly cryptic. Slowly but surely, the game starts to show its age. That sort of retro game jank seems to rear its ugly head as you wander back and forth, trying to figure out what the f*** to do. You know where you have to go and you know the path to get there, but there's no nudge to push you in the right direction. You begin to write the entire experience off. Maybe people are overhyping this game. Maybe everything's just a big nostalgia trip from a time where games were much simpler. It's 2021, not 1991. Things have to change and move forward. F*** this, I'm turning it off. Of course. course, at this point, I didn't do such a thing. I'd set myself a task: complete every game in the 2D part of this franchise prior to Dread's release. So I hit the sack, worked on a couple more videos, and then took another crack at it. Suddenly, it clicked. There weren't any crazy moves needed or anything the game was withholding. Super Metroid gives you all the tools you need for the job, and carefully crafts each room, forcing you to use those tools in unique ways. I had personally become too complacent with the last two games. I knew how the Shine Spark worked. Logically, it should work the same, right? Dead wrong. Its functionality was taken in a new direction. Following the logic specific to this entry, Samus Returns was a pretty linear fare, focusing more on the action elements, so it can't really be compared. But with Zero Mission, the entire map was like one big puzzle. You run around chipping away at the rooms you've missed, and eventually everything opens up. With Super Metroid, each individual room is a puzzle in itself. When you play an Ace Attorney case, and I mean a good one that doesn't rely on bullshit leaps of logic, you can't really progress until you have everything you need. The same is true of Super Metroid. By the time you reach each stage, you have all the tools required at your disposal. If you know where the next thing you need is, you can probably get to it. If you need a certain type of power-up from later, you pretty easily know it too. This game is not being cryptic for the sake of being cryptic, which is what I and many people who dropped this game initially thought. It's a game that encourages you to do some detective work, take in your surroundings properly, and as you do, it becomes one of the most rewarding experiences the franchise has to offer. Now, that's not to say this approach doesn't have its shortcomings. You've still got the map rooms, which help point you in the right direction, but it feels like it's a smidge underdone. Especially in the Norfair areas leading up to Ridley, you sometimes have to make a few leaps of logic to figure out where to go. Plus, you can't place markers on the map itself, so if there's a room that has been explored, say for an exit that's inaccessible, it might not seem like it once you leave said room. Plus here, I feel the backtracking is the worst I've seen so far, especially since it's pushed throughout the whole game as opposed to being tagged on at the end. Maybe it's because I got used to the teleportation system in the last game, but Jesus, going back to old areas felt a whole lot like padding. It's for this reason alone that I feel Super Metroid could easily use a remake next. I know such a statement might seem sacrilegious, but come on, it's 2021. Gaming sensibilities have changed, and accessibility options would really do this wonders. But oh well, the game basically is the way it is. Good old Super Metroid, with no updates unless you go for a modded emulated version. Personally, I've got nothing against that. It was just easier for me to use a Wii U and Elgato combo. Point is, this game appears to have jank, but it actually doesn't. Until it eventually does and you have to consult a map or a walkthrough. I'll leave a link to the most helpful video I came across. Rest in peace, buddy. Speaking with people who've gone through what I've gone through, a map is basically mandatory for the first playthrough unless you've got unlimited time on your hands. And given at this point there's precisely 1 month until the release of Dread, I most certainly don't. Eventually, after becoming accustomed to the controls, figuring out the processes, and dissecting the world and realizing that it was probably a good idea to have a map open on my phone to the side just in case, I came to genuinely like the game. It was an experience that went from high point to high point to high point. Still, I wasn't quite sure why many considered it a masterpiece. It was a fantastic game, no doubt, and definitely a landmark release that practically cemented a new genre, but many people claim it still holds up 100% today. Several Metroid fans tout this as the absolute best Metroid game put out, and I just wasn't sure. I was sure that I liked the game, but I wasn't sure that I loved it. Until the final stage. The final section is probably the best sequence of events the game has to offer. The atmosphere is unparalleled, perfectly conveying how the space pirates have essentially desecrated the ancient temple for their devious plans. The game fakes you out, which sets you up with the expectation to let things play out with the final boss instead of hitting the reset button. The Mother Brain fight has been massively improved. You aren't dealing with antiquated ideas about difficulty, such as spamming you with a billion piles of nonsense and having the boss only take damage when its eyes facing a certain way. Mother Brain's final form kicks in, and it's a perfect mix of terror and excitement. When the scripted section starts, hypothetically you'd think it would fall flat. Given the time this came out, animations are limited, and expressiveness on Samus's part is fairly low, yet somehow you're filled with a sense of shock, followed by a swell of excitement. Your mind travels back to the rest of the game, and you suddenly make sense of all the trials and tribulations that brought you here. The game is tough as balls, and its second half might be a pain in the ass, but it makes this moment much, much sweeter. I've written this section at least 2 times because it's hard to accurately describe my feelings with this game. Is it amazing? Is it Stockholm Syndrome? Eventually though, I realized one simple fact. An experience that stays with you for days after completion, regardless of what medium, is the sign of a true masterpiece. If it takes time for you to sort out how you feel about something, that piece of media has struck a chord with you and will leave you forever changed. That is the mark of a monumentous work of fiction, and why Super Metroid is hailed as a masterpiece. Looking back, this game has way more positives than it does negatives. Every single single boss fight was an absolute joy to tackle, even if some of them were a bit short. The standout for me would easily have to be the weird baby thing in the lava chamber, forcing you to rethink your strategy beyond simply blasting the bastard. The fake out jump scare at the end was the perfect icing on the cake too. Aside from that, the other bosses are all unique and memorable, and at the end of the day, none of them are headache inducing. They're all fun, which is such a rarity for any video game. I can't think of a single moment where I was getting pissed off at them, even if, as I said earlier, some of them were over in a heartbeat. Wait, that's it? The way this game immerses you in its world is masterful, even reimagining set pieces from the original game in neat throwbacks. The art and progression is near perfect. Honestly, I take the X-ray scope over the scan pulse any day. With a bit of tweaking to the map rooms, they could easily present you with the perfect progression system. The grappling hook is ironically more satisfying than its use in Samus Returns, and again, having access to the super missiles and bombs early on allows the world to open up in incredibly unique ways. The pixel art is top-notch, the soundtrack is divine, and the pacing is incredibly tight. I can see why many people fell in love with Metroid after this entry, and I'm definitely glad I persevered past the point where I felt like all was lost. But I still prefer Zero Mission just a bit. Yes, if I had to point out which was the more polished experience, Super would take the cake easily. That said, the backtracking was just too much of a pain in the ass to give it the win here, especially when you get the screw attack, which again destroys key platforms required to take the shortest routes back. Gotta take the long way round instead, motherfucker. Oh, and the screw attack. It's even more of a pain here than it was in Zero Mission. Yes, I'm fully aware that I could easily have turned it off at any time, well, at least I'm aware now, but I'm just going for my preferences when playing the games themselves. Maybe if I played them again, my opinions would change, but for now, this is what I feel. And what the f*** is up with the forced German subtitles? What the hell, Nintendo? If I wanted to hear German, I'd just go back to my abusive father! Plus, beyond pet peeves, I think I prefer the more tight-knit Zebes from the first game. Is it the first game? Technically, it came out after, but it's a remake of the first game. Whatever. Point is, I prefer the interconnected nature of the old new Brinstar to that of the new old Brinstar. No, that still doesn't make any sense. F it. Sure, Super Metroid has the better lineup of bosses, but Zero Mission still has my favorite boss fight of the whole series. And I think I prefer this version of Kraid just a bit. I don't know, it seems just a smidge more menacing. For those reasons, although I really like Super Metroid, my personal preference ever so slightly leans on Zero Mission. I'm seriously hoping the franchise didn't peak too early in my eyes, but I still had fun here. And it was a massive breath of fresh air after the slog that was Samus Returns. God, that game feels so long and boring in comparison after playing through this. I mean, it's a fun game, but it's got nothing on the classics. So that's it. Finally, my thoughts on Super have been put to the page. I'm probably gonna have to go back and edit a bunch of this so I'm not contradicting myself constantly, but hey, a game that forces you to rethink your opinions day after you finish it must be doing something right. Anywho, 3 down, 1 to... When I started this marathon, I was most concerned for Metroid Fusion specifically. Given that the genre is heavily exploration-based and that people often placed a disclaimer that this game was heavily linear when discussing it, I didn't know if it was going to gel with the game style or not. However, as I played each game, my fears subsided. Zero Mission proved that the GBA was perfectly capable of handling expansive platforming worlds, whilst Samus Returns proved that even if linearity was annoying, it wouldn't necessarily detract from the Metroidvania-y good times. Then I started hearing people getting really excited over the inclusion of the SAX, a monstrous being with powers beyond compare. The final push that got me really excited was the combined praises from several of my friends, who claimed it would likely end up my favorite, and I am so sorry to let you down. Legitimately, I feel guilty about this because I flat out did not like this game. At every point, it feels like Metroid Fusion makes deliberate design choices that might make sense on paper, but in practice are either handled poorly or didn't need to be made at all. And sure, given this came out before Zero Mission, a little bit of leeway can be given, but when all the issues pile up, the whole thing quickly becomes a farce. My biggest gripe with the game would have to be how much at odds it is with what Metroidvanias stand for. The genre prides itself on exploration and puzzle solving, and even with a somewhat linear structure, it's perfectly possible to do just that, as seen with Samus Returns. Metroid Fusion says, "F all that shit, you're being told what to do and when to do it." The game pushes this computer navigation system on you, and at every point you're basically required to go to it and let it tell you where to go and how to progress. Every time I tried looking around to try and naturally figure out where to go next, I'd hit roadblocks that halted progress. So I thought, well, I've exhausted all my options, guess I'll check the computer again for a hint, only for it to lock me off and insist I go to a completely different location because the plot demands it. Yes, you, Samus, you're stupid for trying to actually play things smartly. You've gotta be coddled like a normal person because shock people's intuition. Now, like all the other issues with this game, this idea might seem good on paper. The Game Boy Advance is, well, a portable system. When it comes to pre-Switch portable gaming, certain design choices needed to be made in order to make sure the player was able to start and stop at will. Thing is, there are far less ham-fisted ways to do this, such as adding in extra save rooms. Oh, it's already done that. Well, adding a comprehensive map system also helps. Oh, they've done this too. On top of this, having a sleep functionality built in can also help, and they've got a built-in sleep function for the Game Boy. And all modern emulators can create save states anyway, so what's the point here? And I get there's a story reason for having this annoying prick in the game, but to me, it seems painstakingly obvious that they developed a narrative reason for the computer to be in the game, as opposed to creating a comprehensive narrative and naturally adding in story elements from that. Which was what Super Metroid was able to do damn well, and it came out 8 years prior. My problem is that it just feels like this game isn't respecting players' intelligence, and it's not a good feeling. None of this is helped by the banal level design either. The Metroidvania genre is one known for expansive worlds that engross you in both atmosphere and level design. I like those things, but apparently Metroid Fusion does not. I'm all for swapping out the series staples for new ideas, but what we have here is extremely boring. I'm not quite sure how to put it into words, but the platforming feels much more engaging in the other 3 games. There's something that's just fun about traversing the caverns of Zebes and SR-388. With Metroid Fusions, it's just shafts, corridors, and warehouses. Shafts, corridors, and warehouses. Shafts, corridors, and... When you combine the lackluster level layouts with boring platforming challenges in comparison to the previous games, along with the previously mentioned increased linearity and the constant coddling from that AI son of a bitch, traversing the space station becomes a chore. Plus, beyond that, the platforming feels oddly claustrophobic, and I don't mean this in an intentional way. The rooms feel oddly gamey due to how small they are, as opposed to extensions of an actual space station or part of an actual planet. I get it, this is indeed a video game, and there's always going to be that element, but to this extent, it just doesn't feel right. And if they wanted to push that claustrophobic feeling, sure, it could have worked great, but they really didn't. The claustrophobia comes from lackluster level design, not intentional atmosphere. It doesn't help that they expect you to traverse these areas over and over again to make up for the lack of content. It's essentially the same problem as the Final Fantasy VII Remake, pushing you back and forth throughout the same hallwayed levels for inconsequential side quests. That same concept can be applied to the hidden secrets, which aren't fun to find since the level design doesn't afford such. Yes, I know these games are extremely different in genre, but if I can compare Metroid to Xenoblade, Final Fantasy shouldn't be that much of a stretch. For an example on how to do claustrophobic level design right, look no further than the final level of Super Metroid. This right here is a masterclass in how to make a cold, sterile, scientific environment. So, how did Metroid Fusion take the lessons learned from this? Bright, inviting colors with a hint of that Nintendo charm. It's at complete odds with both the story and the style of gameplay, and it really pisses me off. This game could have easily been Alien meets Metroid, but apparently we gotta dumb it down for the portable audience. And whilst we're on that point, I really hate that excuse. People often defend this game's level design and art style with a statement that it's on the Game Boy, but Zero Mission a couple of years later proved that none of this has to apply. You can treat your audience with respect and still deliver an experience that functions fine on a portable device. And sure, that game came out 2 years after Fusion, learning from the mistakes made here, but that only shows that they acknowledge this game had mistakes to begin with. Right from the get-go, portable gaming has proven you can do large and expansive worlds that feel like full AAA experiences in spite of their limited hardware. It doesn't matter which console you're dealing with, it's entirely possible to strive for a masterwork on a system that fits in your pockets. As someone who grew up with handheld gaming, only allowed to own a DS Lite and eventually a 3DS, the idea that it's fine because it's a handheld always bugs me. Like, no, we deserve proper experiences too. Now, truth be told, I don't mind linear games in concept. They can work very well, provided a couple of things. Firstly, the gameplay needs to be carefully crafted and fast-paced. 2D platforms can do this rather well, but not in the Metroidvania genre. Level-based platformers do this much better, because the gameplay speed can be carefully crafted. With Metroidvanias, these two styles are at odds with each other, so already that's thrown out the window. Secondly, the story itself needs to be damn good. You need to be invested in the game's world and characters, so that even through some of the more troublesome moments, you still have that urge to keep playing. Metroid Fusion doesn't have that either. The story is so melodramatic with giant walls of text placing great importance and emotion on shit I just don't care about. Remember how much emotion Super Metroid was able to carry in its finale without a single word of dialogue? They say a picture is worth 1,000 words. Unfortunately, Fusion would rather use those 1,000 words and still somehow not get the point across. The final act plot twist was kinda neat, I guess, but even so, it didn't really evoke any sort of emotional reaction. I'm sure it was foreshadowed well enough, but when you've been lulled into a sense of boredom and constant instructions to go here, download this, go here, beat this boss, go here, I just don't care. Also, towards the end of the game, Samus basically hacks a computer with the power of friendship, which then leads to the wildlife from Zebes saving her ass. Yep, the game's that kinda dumb. So much for respecting the player's intelligence. And can I say, I did not find a single antagonist threatening in this game. The concept of a parasite morphing into any enemy you could imagine sounds amazing. But when they end up looking like this, I'm sorry, I just can't take them seriously. These aren't dangerous, they're the Metroid equivalent of Mario coins. Instinctively, I want to collect them all, which is not the kind of reaction you should have from the game's main antagonists. Christ, even Bowser is more intimidating than this shit. The boss fights aren't much better. Beyond the fact that I just don't find Space Goo that intimidating, and knowing that ultimately that's all these things are diminishes their fear factor, they're just not that good. I can't think of any real stinkers like Mother Brain from Zero Mission, but most were just a whole lot of nothing, really. I was looking forward to a game where every enemy delved into the body horror aspects of that bee thing that scared the shit out of me. But instead I got greeted with crab robots, Boring Damage Sponge Ridley, One-Eyed Monster, crab robots again, Goro Majima, the female equivalent of Netarare. None of these bosses are bad per se, but they're all ultimately forgettable. Most of them boil down to waiting for the monster to show its mouth on the bottom, then raining upward hellfire on them. The only challenge really comes from the small hitboxes, which is a pretty grave oversight for what was originally intended for a screen the size of a teaspoon. And it's not like Johnny Hodges here is much better. I was under the impression that this thing would be terrifying, a constant threat throughout the game. But you want to know how many times it shows up? 5! A total of 5 times! Well, to be honest, 2 of those times are mainly cutscenes that Samus can't really interact with, so that only comes to 3 actually meaningful cases. This kind of shit makes me finally understand why Dread took so long to come out. The technology behind the Emmys probably needed to be perfect. That said, for Ben Webster over here, I'm not asking for the AI to be improved or anything of the sort. I'm just asking for them to add more interactions into the game. Granted, it looks like they're fixing that by adding 5 Emmys for you to deal with in Dread, making them a core part of the gameplay, but still doesn't change my overall boredom with Fusion. And ultimately, that's how I felt for the majority of the game. Bored as f***. I kept going because aside from genuinely wanting to enjoy these games, I'd set myself the task of playing through each one for the sake of this video. Had fun factor been the only factor at play here, I would have likely canned it and watched the rest on YouTube. For the first time in this series, I can't think of a single thing I actively enjoyed without a but being added after it. Even the music is painfully uninteresting, with a woefully short track list that doesn't even go for quality over quantity. The songs are a slight step above the atmospheric whooshes of Samus Returns, but they're all basic as f***. Actually, let me make a quick correction on that. So as I was editing this video, I had to download the soundtrack for, just regular music in the background. Turns out there's actually quite an extensive track list. So it's not that there aren't a lot of tracks, it's that all of them sound the same. And they're all woefully short. They keep repeating and repeating and repeating themselves. And before you tell me, oh, hardware limitations this, hardware limitations that, Zero Mission was able to get over this pretty goddamn easily. So yeah, knowing this, I would put this soundtrack below Samus Returns. They just did not put the effort in here, and it stinks. Even the sound design is off. It's a bit hard to explain, but the sound sounds incredibly bit crushed. Now that would have been fine on its own, but then you go to Zero Mission and you can see they've massively improved on this aspect. It shows that the Game Boy Advance can do some pretty interesting thing with sound design. It's a little bit difficult to explain. Let me just play both of them for you. Yeah, Metroid Fusion sounds like I'm playing it out of a Nokia speaker. What the f***'s going on here? Anyway, it's all down to ideas and executions. The ideas they had for this game might have made sense on paper, and some of them could have even worked, but the ones that could have ended up not, and the ones that wouldn't have worked from the outset went ahead anyway. And I'm well aware people will defend this game because of the time it came out and because of the system it came out on. But I'm sorry, I just can't afford it the same leeway. Personally, if you're playing through the games, I'd say this one is an easy skip. Honestly, it even puts into perspective how much of a return to form Samus Returns was, I now have a lot more respect for that game. I'm still happy for the Metroid series to try new things in the future, but this just ain't how you do it, bud. That said, even in spite of a downer ending, I'm really glad I did this marathon. I was still introduced to 3 incredibly great games that cemented Metroid as a landmark series in gaming history. I now totally get why people have been clamoring for new games in this series for almost a decade, and why there was such celebration upon Dread's announcement. Initially, I thought I'd wait a bit to play Dread since 4 Metroid games back to back is a bit much. I'd pick up the special edition copy, but let it sit for a month before diving in. However, 3 things have happened. 1. Metroid Fusion. Enough said about that. 2. I'm finishing the script on the 16th of September. That's basically just shy of a month before Dread comes out, giving me plenty of breathing room to focus on other games and other projects. And 3. Finishing the script has really cemented my love for the series. Looking back at my roughly 2-month journey, well, it's got me hungering for more Metroid. So bring on the dread, bring on the exploration, bring on the atmosphere, bring on the terror. I sure as hell will be able to appreciate it a lot more now that I've gone through this experience. And yes, in hindsight, maybe it's not the most necessary thing to do. As much as fans hate to admit, Metroid is a rather story-light series. The exception of this, of course, being Fusion, but enough beating a dead mother brain on that disaster. If this video has piqued your interest in the other games, I can at least recommend 3 out of the 4, but for me, my time talking about Metroid is long done. It's time to get playing. Hit me with your best shot and instill me with your greatest terror.